Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Pivot Point series by the Peninsula Foundation. In a world of shifting alliances and emerging threats, understanding global security is more critical than ever before. The Pivot Point brings together experts in fields of defense, security, geopolitics, and international relations to explore the key moments shaping our world today. Each episode delves into the critical decisions, strategies, and trends driving global security, from military strategy to diplomacy and emerging technologies. Join us as we unpack the issues that could pivot the balance of power and impact the future of global stability. Hello, and welcome back to the third episode of the Pivot Point series, Decoding the 2024 BRICS Summit, Key Takeaways, Emerging Agendas, and Global Impact. We have with us today Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharyya. Ambassador Bhattacharya, a career diplomat with the Indian Foreign Service 1987 to specialized in diplomacy, security, and economic engagement. Post-retirement, he consults on policy and corporate advisory roles. As the Secretary in Ministry of External Affairs, he oversaw the Arab region, Israel, COVID relief, diaspora affairs, and served as India's BRICS Sherpa. He was ambassador to Switzerland, Turkey, and Egypt, advancing bilateral relations, economic exchanges, and strategic partnerships. His earlier roles included crafting India's Act East policy, boundary negotiations in Dhaka and Beijing, and enhancing ties with ASEAN, Japan, and the EU. Ambassador Bhattacharya has lectured widely on foreign policy and contributed to prominent publications and maintains an active social media presence. Educated in economics at St. Stephen's College and Delhi School of Economics, he further studied Chinese in Hong Kong and completed programs at ISB Hyderabad and Cambridge. Welcome, sir.
I'm delighted to be here with you.
Thank you so much, sir. So, in the context of the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and Gaza, seen by as the outcome of a geopolitical steering of the West, is BRICS now being seen as a facilitator of a new world order or a new multipolar world order?
Well, conflicts are becoming much more common today, as you have pointed out, because in addition to the actual hot conflict in Europe, Ukraine, or in the Middle East, in Palestine, we also have tensions in other parts of the world, including in the South China Sea. Now, what this has led to is a certain realization that the multilateral system is unable to cope with the challenges of peace and security. And so other means are often adopted to bring about conflict resolution or peace and security to regions because they are imperative for our continuance of stability and growth that most of us aspire for. What we do see is that there are certain plurilateral groups that are now coming to the fore. And amongst these plurilateral groups, BRICS has certainly been very representative. But it must be realized that BRICS essentially represents a group of emerging economies of fairly large size, and therefore they have a huge weight in the geo-economic space. But on the geopolitical space, it is still largely controlled by the institutions that were established in the last century after the Second World War. And so while there is a move towards multipolarity, particularly because of emerging economies and developing countries, what we do find is that there is no single representative that can take on this challenge to a very confident extent. But BRICS is certainly playing a growing role in this particular aspect.
What is the major outcome or significance of the recently concluded Kazan Summit in terms of strategic signaling, global cooperation, and global governance?
Well, as you know, the BRICS grouping has annual summits, and this year in Kazan, hosted by the Russian presidency, was particularly significant because on the last few occasions, Russia had not been able to be at summit level because of its conflict in Ukraine. But this particular summit not only brought about the BRICS grouping as the original five, but it also included the new members who had joined or had been invited in Johannesburg last year. So this was an expanded BRICS grouping. And we also saw that at the Kazan meeting, BRICS, because of its economic success and the kind of economic and diplomatic space that BRICS provides to aspiring middle powers and regional powers, that BRICS has become like a magnet for the global south. And so there were many, many countries from the global south who wanted to be part of the BRICS grouping and that BRICS ethos. And accordingly, at Kazan, and this was one of the more significant outcomes of the Kazan Summit, they agreed on a second tier of what one can say partner countries. And they've invited 13 countries. Interestingly, these countries come from ASEAN region, from the SCO. We have one country that is from NATO, which is allied to the West, and also representation from Latin America and Africa. So it's a very comprehensive representation in terms of the expansion that BRICS now proposes to do. The second big outcome of Kazan was that it was focused on the economic development agenda. And I think on this, some of the issues that came up, particularly those relating to the monetary policy aspects, because as you know, they have been discussing the issue of trade in local currency, a BRICS currency, and financing settlement mechanisms for their trade and capital account. And there was a lot of advancement in that particular area, though a lot of this is really country specific and has not happened on a BRICS wide scale yet. Along with this economic agenda, there was also other detail that came about. You would recall that when Ukraine happened, there was a severe energy security and food security crisis. And BRICS has now proposed the establishment of a new food exchange. This would be on the lines of what the Chicago Exchange does, and also a new metals exchange, which would be, in a sense, similar to what the London Metals Exchange does. And these are very significant items as we go ahead on these particular area. And of course, BRICS continued with the other agenda items on the development front. The third takeaway from the BRICS summit in Kazan, I see, is on the idea of global governance. Because what has happened in recent past is that there have been certain instances where, because of conflicts, and conflicts are very complicated, they don't have just one single reason. There have been sanctions, often unilateral sanctions imposed by the West, which disrupt the normal economic activity and the tendency trend towards growth and development that developing countries would seek to have. And so there have been measures that have been initiated which now try to not replace, but find alternative mechanisms through which you can deal with such difficult situations. So in many ways, I would say Kazan has been a signaling effort to the West, saying that BRICS is not opposed to the West. BRICS seeks to work with the West. BRICS seeks to coordinate much more closely with G20, find common agenda with G7. And at the same time, work about structures so that there is leverage on the multilateral system to bring about better understanding towards reform of the multilateral network.
So, in what ways does the expansion and inclusion of other countries of the BRICS membership challenge or complement the West dominated multilateral forums like the UN, the G7, and the G20? Because in the Kazan Summit, Kazan Declaration, they've also mentioned that they do not wish to totally get rid of the UN system, but modify concentrated powers on certain countries in the system. And will the BRICS expand more rapidly in the future because more and more countries realize the potential that BRICS has? While Argentina withdrew from the BRICS, Saudi Arabia is still withholding its joining the BRICS. Are these countries being forced by the US to review their decision, and how is this working in the world order now?
Well, you've analyzed it very correctly. The world is in a situation of flux. Flux is because the geo-economic rise has not been fully complemented by the geopolitical, geostrategic shifts that need to happen. In other words, this imbalance has already happened, and that creates a lot of conflict, particularly for aspiring countries. Now, when BRICS was first thought about in 2001, when Jim O'Neill of the Goldman Sachs wrote that famous report on BRIC as the engine of growth, he had actually made a very significant recommendation to the G7 in those days to reform itself and bring in the BRIC representatives on the table so that there would be a more participative world order in terms of, at that point of time, financial stability issues. That did not really happen. In fact, after Crimea, even the G8, which included Russia, was disbanded and they went back to the G7. But of course, starting from about 2008 onwards, the G7 also escalated its outreach process to the G20 because it had realized that G7 by itself could not control the financial and development issues of the world. And although the prime concern was about stability, the inclusion of the developing world, the EMDCs in particular, to the G20 process brought about the development aspect. And in many ways, I think the G20 did serve a very, very useful purpose. And even today, it continues to be the bridge between the developed and the developing world. And I think we should not have an antagonistic sense about the G20. I think that is one where a lot of collaboration happens, particularly because I see the multilateral system in coma. And what is required is serious amendment of the UN Charter itself. We saw that when the Future Summit was held recently, and then the Pact for the Future was announced, it made certain overtures towards the reform of the UN Security Council, and the UN General Assembly so that it could be more representative. But it fell short of actually recommending an intergovernmental negotiation process, because unless you have that piece of paper that you are going to work on to bring about that change, nothing happens. And let us be honest, even within BRICS, there is a certain party that we are all familiar with that has come in the way of UN reforms. And so while we often talk about these bilateral objectives and initiatives, we sometimes find that while we can work it out at the BRICS level, because that is a small grouping relatively rather than the multilateral one, and we can cast our bilateral differences aside for a while and continue with the group agenda, when it comes to the multilateral, that becomes the big problem. And I think this particular narrative that came about because of economic slowdown and the conflict situation was one that led to a certain contestation between the West on one side and Russia, China on the other. So the narrative changed to the US and many in the West saying, oh, but BRICS is anti-West. And at the same time, it is also true that there were many instances where Russia and China came out with anti-West comments. But we should not mix this up with the BRICS movement and the BRICS ethos, because BRICS continued to be not directed towards other countries. But in this particular process of trying to build allies, there was the use of various mechanisms. And to some extent, we saw the change happening because Argentina, which was invited in Johannesburg to join the BRICS movement, declined after the elections and a new president came in. And we've seen that Saudi Arabia has been in limbo, in an observer status kind of a place. So there are obviously geopolitics that have come into the BRICS movement as well.
In terms of that, how is the coalition balancing competing national interests while also pursuing for a collective global influence or a governance pattern?
Yeah, I think when we were a small group of 5 countries, and all of us were fairly large economies because most of us were beyond middle power status, it was possible to kind of look at some of these bilateral differences and discuss them in bilateral forum and not let them impinge the overall objective of the BRICS 5. I think even when we were having the discussions last year, after the entry of the additional new members, and they were taking part in various forum in the ministerials and others, we did find that we were able to find common ground, despite the fact that in some of the other grouping countries as well, there are differences that exist between, say, for instance, the UAE and Iran, or Egypt and Ethiopia, quite apart from some of the others. But it was becoming evident that while on economic issues, you would find a greater sense of purpose and coming together towards the group objectives, on geopolitical issues, they were proving to be more difficult. You would remember when the larger group of the G20, when India was in the chair there was always a fear that we may not even have a New Delhi declaration, and consensus came only at the last moment. So when you have a larger group, I think consensus, and consensus has been at the foundation of the BRICS ethos. So consensus will become more difficult, and one will have to put in much more effort, particularly on strategic issues, on geopolitics. But I expect that the focus of BRICS will remain more on the economic and development ideas, where I think consensus is much easier to obtain.
In terms of the financial modifications that the Kazan Declaration had mentioned, what are the geopolitical implications of BRICS establishing its own financial mechanisms independent of the ones that have been established in the post 1945 World Economic Order? For example, more countries of the global south now prefer borrowing from the New Development Bank and the AIIB as compared to the World Bank and IMF. And with increasing mutual trade in local currencies and rising prospects of a BRICS currency, what is the post 1945 World Economic Order based on? Like, it's no more based on the Bretton Woods institutions alone. Is that unraveling now?
I think BRICS from the very outset had said that it did not seek to replace the old post 95 systems, whether it is the UN or whether it is the Bretton Woods financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, but to supplement the efforts. And also at the same time to bring about a new set of rules and guidelines which would direct the financing of development projects that the EMDC required. So emerging markets and developing countries have very unique requirements. And if the money is going to come from the developed world, from the OECD alone, their priorities will determine how that money goes and what the stipulations need to be. And some of that need to be replaced. And it was with that particular objective that the NDB was set up. And at that time itself, it was the BRICS 5 which set it up. It was made very clear that BRICS, the NDB, was not to replace. And it had a relatively small capital. It could not really replace the huge resources that were available with the World Bank and the IMF. I remember the BRICS also set up the CRA, or the Contingency Reserve Arrangement, which was in a sense similar to what IMF does in terms of stabilization funds. So BRICS did do this, and because it had that geo-economic benefit, so to say, it had that muscle of its economy, so that it could set up these institutions. And in the early days, because the NDB was found to be so useful to countries in the developing world, many of them wanted to join it. And in fact, 4 of them, the modalities were finalized during the India presidency in 2021. 4 of them joined, Algeria, Egypt, Bangladesh, and the United Arab Emirates joined the NDB. And that was, in a sense, a good basis for moving ahead. The other aspect of trade in local currency is also very important. This really started in 2014 at the Fortaleza Summit in Brazil, where the agreement was there for the first time on trade in local currencies. And I think there had been many arrangements that had happened on a strictly bilateral level. It wasn't a BRICS-wide initiative, although the agreement was BRICS-wide. Many of the actual implementing mechanisms were more bilateral. And we've seen that grow over a period of time. And in the reign of sanctions, it is found that this has a certain relevance as well. Though it should not be seen as a response to sanction, because as I pointed out, it started long time back. In addition to being able to do this, what we were able to do with trade in local currency was also to get into new markets and explore new mechanisms of counter trade, barter trade, of setting up the local currency accounts in each other's countries. And that meant that at the end of the day, you would also need a financial settlement mechanism. And so BRICS set up a task force led by the finance ministers to look into this financing settlement mechanism. Normally this happens through the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, in Switzerland, where all the central bank governors come together and do their financing settlement. So BRICS has initiated a similar process. What has also happened at the same time is that the mix of currencies in your country's reserves has also been changing towards having more of local currencies or BRICS national currencies. And so that is also change, just as a lot of the NDB financing is now done in local currency. So that is a big change. The last thing is about the BRICS currency. Now, the BRICS currency was an idea that was floated some time ago. It had a Russian, Chinese backing, and it also had some support from the Brazilians. But my sense is, and I think it has come out in Kazan, that a BRICS currency, even in a digital form or even in an index form linked to trade, is still a far way off, because that means that you have to have a very much more sophisticated monetary policy, which not only has to be sophisticated for your own economy, but has to be integrated and harmonized amongst BRICS economies. And that is something that we are nowhere close to being. So I think a BRICS currency is really far away. And if they go ahead in a rapid manner, it would be a very, very terrible mistake to make.
We spoke about how countries have to manage their rivalries and also cooperate in BRICS. But in particular, how are China and India balancing their regional rivalries while they have to maintain a shared political and economic goals within the BRICS, particularly as it is perceived that the BRICS aims to counter the Western influence? How are these relations changing? Are they improving, or in the future, will they backtrack?
Right. So, you know what, in India and China have had a period when we've had very strong cooperation and collaboration, particularly on the economic side. And this was at a time when we had relative peace. In fact, we had peace agreements on the boundary issue between India and China. And so if you look at the late 80s and the early 2000s, this has been the period when there was peace and tranquility on the boundary, and there was very strong growth of economic relations and coordination on various regional and global issues as well. Whether it is on climate change or on regional policies, we worked very closely together. But China broke the agreements that it had with India, and its actions on the boundary were totally unwarranted and illegal. And therefore, this meant that the bilateral front had to be dealt with in a manner that both countries saw fit. But it must be the credit of both sides, India and China, that while there was this very serious setback on the bilateral relations, they did not allow it to impinge their broader interests in the BRICS grouping and in other groupings as well. We are also part of our partnership with ASEAN in the SCO, and so we work collaboratively in other groups as well. So we did not let this bilateral thing impinge other groups, but seek to resolve them at the bilateral level. It was, of course, rather coincidental and heartening at the same time that at the Kazan Summit, there was a meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping, at which they kind of confirmed the process of movement towards the settlement of the break that had happened in the border areas in terms of the violations that China had caused and the disengagement that had resulted. And as you know, patrolling has now resumed from the Indian side to some of the old locations in Depsang and Demchok in particular. And of course, there are other areas where these still have to be done. So I think what happens is that mature countries like India and China have the space and the flexibility to deal with bilateral issues in their own way, in the bilateral format, while they can continue the engagement and even cooperation on regional or plurilateral groupings, such as the BRICS or others. And I think this is an example of maturity that has to be reflected. But one cannot expect that all countries can have a similar kind of engagement, because certain issues can dominate the overall national agenda to such an extent that it might cast a shadow even on its impact or engagement with other countries.
So you spoke about energy security as well, as one of the key takeaways of the Kazan Summit. What are the strategies and the challenges that are there for BRICS in addressing global security issues, such as cybersecurity and technology cooperation, within a framework that respects each nation's sovereignty?
So BRICS has been very mindful of making sure that it advances not only on the development front, but also on many of the non-traditional threats as well. So, apart from the classic security concerns, which is, war between countries, BRICS has been very focused on the non-traditional security threats. And this includes issues like counterterrorism cooperation, legal cooperation to deal with trafficking, other illicit activities, and of course, the new area of cybersecurity. And we have specific working groups within BRICS that look at each of these issues. And I must say that the collaboration on this has been very, very positive. And in some ways, if we kind of look at some of the other groups, for instance, the SCO, which also had a very high anti-terrorism focus and is now shifting towards the cybersecurity focus as well, we find a great commonality amongst nations where we look at these non-traditional security threats in a more purposeful, coordinated manner so that when we move towards global legislation, because at the end of the day, you will need multilateral arrangements that do this, that the regional groups or these plurilateral groups are in alignment with what the overall multilateral priority is. The other aspect, which is of technology, new technology, is also something that BRICS has really paid great focus on. New economy, the fourth industrial revolution, innovation center and link up. These have been issues on which BRICS has set up not only specific working groups, but has also set up specialized centers where we can have closer networking of people who are the stakeholders, as well as joint R&D projects. The pandemic response, for instance, is also one of these, or the constellation of satellites for resource data, for land resource data setting, or the investment data that we have created this database on, which can be shared amongst BRICS countries. So these are all very significant moves that have happened in the BRICS format.
So we see that BRICS nations such as Russia and China are navigating Western sanctions. And how is BRICS as a grouping trying to strategize and mitigate these impacts of Western sanctions on its member nations? And what alternative trade mechanisms are being considered within the BRICS to ease these difficulties?
I think the issue of sanctions is something that deserves a much deeper examination, because there are sanctions that are permissible under the UN Charter norms, and those are meant to be observed by all countries. But what we have seen is that there is a trend towards unilateral sanctions that are often imposed by the West, and sometimes because of the deep economic connectivity that is there, many other countries also become subject to those sanctions, even if they do not necessarily subscribe to them. So this has caused an issue in the global, I would say, not just the economic environment, but also in the way the international norms are played out. Because as we discussed earlier, conflicts are often very complicated issues, and there can't be a straight line or one cause and effect kind of analysis. Sometimes economic misdemeanors, what China is accused of, are also a little more complicated, and some of these need to be resolved in the WTO, for instance. But there are obviously certain instances where whether it is the case of trade access being denied, or infringement of IPRs, or holding back critical materials, which China has done on the economic field, or on the strategic field, like the transgressions of national sovereignty, of attacking another country, as Russia has done, are issues that need to be discussed and analyzed more deeply. So BRICS as a grouping, as you would have noticed, has not really come out with a very strong comment on this particular issue, because this still requires much deeper investigation. So there are certain transgressions that have been committed by certain BRICS members, which have invoked certain other transgressions by the West in the imposition of sanctions. So it's still a very, very nebulous area in terms of having an overall rule-making approach. That said, what the BRICS has been doing is to look at alternate mechanisms, because BRICS' priority is to ensure that its development path is not impeded. The whole idea of the creation of BRICS was that it would supplement what it could do with the Western world and the NDBs and in the development thrust, because the citizens of BRICS countries are thirsty for that growth. And today we have a situation where BRICS has shown its adaptability. So in some ways, BRICS is one of the few 21st century organizations. So in a sense, it is a Gen Z organization, and it has shown a remarkable dynamism in terms of the way it has expanded its reach, it has covered its agenda. It has also shown great success, and the fact that more countries want to come into the BRICS fold is an indication of its success. So I think what BRICS has done is to try and develop mechanisms. And also remember, these are all big countries. Their normal weight is significant. Its GDP is bigger than that of the G7. And by 2026, the trade volume of the BRICS countries will surpass that of the G7 as well. It's a critical, it's huge in terms of landmass, in terms of population share of the world. It has got command over energy resources. It commands a very large proportion of food production. It's access to critical materials, and it's also catching up on the field of technology development and innovation, as well as financing mechanisms. So BRICS is becoming an entity where BRICS needs the world and the world needs BRICS. So I do not see a situation where an antagonistic sense between BRICS and the West is going to be beneficial for BRICS members. BRICS members remain convinced that their future lies in working in a more collaborative manner. And therefore, I think in some ways, the role of countries like India, which have equal access and friends on both sides, whether it is in the Western bloc or in the Russia-China grouping, and we have strong interests with both sides. So the role of countries like India will become very important. I was very happy to see the new list of countries that are supposed to become partner countries, because countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand in the ASEAN group will bring that balance that is necessary, because this is not a fight. Also, the admission of Turkey, for instance, which is a NATO member, is a very significant one. If they do become a full member, the kind of weight that they would bring, and the bridge. And eventually, when we look at the bridge, I have great faith in the G20 mechanism, because at a time when we need more commonality between the developed and the developing world, G20 provides that particular bridge. And now with the inclusion of the African Union, that entire continent, in a sense, is also represented. So I would wish to see BRICS move in a collaborative manner, focus on economic development, graduate to global governance structures, and to create a world that actually means better for everyone else.
That's definitely a very different perspective than what we see in the conventional narrative that says BRICS is there to challenge the Western dominance in international order. And BRICS countries are looking to not work with the West, but work separately in their own economic and political interests.
You're right. I think that narrative was not there in the beginning, because Jim O'Neill called for collaboration. The idea of BRICS was born in the 2006 meeting of the G8 outreach, where the leaders of India, Russia, and China met. And in the same year, subsequently, the foreign ministers of the BRIC countries met in New York and formally launched the BRICS movement. At that time, it was quite clear that they were looking for collaboration. And 2 years later, when G20 was upgraded to summit level, it was still looking for collaboration. But post the period when the economic downturn started happening in OECD, when recession or recessionary trends hit them. And at the same time, you saw conflict, particularly and tension, particularly concerning Russia and China, that the antagonistic sense started coming into the narrative. I think countries like India, Brazil, Indonesia do not need to subscribe to this new narrative because we believe that it is not through confrontation, but collaboration that our interests are going to be furthered. So we need to work on that older narrative that was there. And I think G20 as the bridge remains.
Before we wrap up, I just would like to take a moment to extend a huge thank you to you. I know I speak for all of us when I say it's been such a pleasure having you on this series today, sir. Your insights and your expertise have truly added so much value to this conversation. I'm sure our listeners are walking away with a lot to think about, and I know I certainly am. It's not every day that we get a chance to talk with an expert in the diplomatic field and have such a meaningful discussion. And I'm so grateful for your time and willingness to share your knowledge with us, sir. You've definitely given us a lot to reflect on, and I know I'm not alone in saying this. I hope we get to have you back again soon, sir. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity to share my views on an issue that is very important. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Pivot Point, brought to you by the Peninsula Foundation. We hope the insights shared today have deepened your understanding of the dynamic intersections between international relations, geopolitics, defense, and security. Be sure to subscribe to stay updated on our latest interviews with experts shaping the future of global affairs. If you enjoyed today's discussion, don't forget to leave us a comment and share the podcast with people who might be interested. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep questioning the world around you.